Section 1.3 is on properties of numbers. The first set of properties we have are the properties of equality. Those are the reflexive, symmetric, transitive, and substitution properties. The reflexive property basically says A equals A. Anything is equal to itself. The symmetric property says that if A is equal to B, then B is equal to A. In other words, there's a certain symmetry. You can just flip-flop A and B. The transitive property says that if A equals B, and if B equals C, then A equals C. Since both of those equations contain B, then I can say that A equals C. And then the substitution property says that if A equals B, then A can replace B. Wherever you see a B, you can replace it or substitute in an A. There are two addition properties, the additive identity and the additive inverse. The additive identity says that if you take a number and you add 0 to it, you get the same number back. So adding 0 gives you the identical number. The additive inverse says A plus the opposite of A equals 0. Any number plus its opposite, or the negative of that number, is going to equal 0. We have three multiplication properties: multiplicative identity, property of 0, and inverse. The multiplicative identity says that A times 1 is equal to A. Any number times 1 is equal to itself. If you multiply a number by 1, you get the identical number back. The multiplicative property of 0 says A times 0 equals 0. Anything times 0 is equal to 0. The multiplicative inverse says A times 1 over A is equal to 1. Any number times its reciprocal, that is the number flipped and with a 1 on top, is equal to 1. So A times 1 over A is equal to 1. The two commutative properties we have are of addition and multiplication. Commutative property of addition says A plus B is equal to B plus A. In other words, the order that I add does not matter. The commutative property of multiplication says A times B is equal to B times A. So the order that I multiply does not matter. I can rearrange them. And we have two associative properties. The associative property of addition says A plus the quantity B plus C is equal to the quantity A plus B plus C. In other words, notice I'm not rearranging anything. I still have A, B, and C in that particular order, but the order in which I add them has changed. In this case, I add B and C first, and then I add A to it. On this side, if I add A and B first, and then add C to it, I get the same thing. The associative property of multiplication says A times the product of B and C is equal to the product of A and B times C. In other words, I would multiply B and C first, B times C first, and then multiply it by A. And that's the same as multiplying A times B and then multiplying it by C. So notice again, I haven't rearranged the order of my terms. I'm just multiplying them in kind of a different order. I'm doing these two first in this case and these two first in the other case. So here's some examples like you'll see in the textbook. The directions say evaluate each expression and name the property used in each step. So here I have the quantity 1 divided by 5 times 14. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply order of operations. So 1 divided by 5, I'm going to write that as 1/5, and that's going to be multiplied times 5 and then times 14. The property that I used in that case is substitution, because instead of writing 1 divided by 5, I wrote it as 1/5. Now, applying order of operations, I have two multiplications, so I'll do them in order from left to right. 1/5 times 5 is 1 times 14, and 1/5 times 5, I'm multiplying a number by its reciprocal, so that's the multiplicative inverse. And to finish this problem, 1 times 14 is 14. And remember, this is the property that says if you multiply anything by 1, you get the same number back. And that's the multiplicative identity. Here's another example. 5 times the quantity 14 minus 5 plus 6 times the quantity 3 plus 7. Now some of you that are familiar with the distributive property might want to do that, but don't do that yet. We're going to follow the order of operations, which says I'm going to deal with what's in the parentheses first. So I need to do 14 minus 5, which gives me 9. So I'll have 5 times 9. And I can actually do a couple here at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and do 3 plus 7, which is 10. And the property I used there is just substitution. Because this, hold on. Let's abbreviate. Substitution. There we go. Because this operation didn't involve any ones or zeros or positive and negative of the same number or any reciprocals, it's basically going to be substitution. So what I did was, instead of saying 14 minus 5, I substituted in 9. Instead of saying 3 plus 7, I substituted in 10. So now we can go ahead and use the order of operations. I'll multiply. So we'll have 45 plus 60. And again, that's another substitution. And then adding those two, I get 105, and that's another substitution. So often, if it doesn't involve any special numbers, zeros, ones, reciprocals, opposites, it's pretty much going to be substitution. Example number 3 is 23 plus 42 plus 37. Now, your temptation is going to be to grab your calculator, plug those numbers in, but that's not really what they're looking for you to do here. What the textbook is doing is, it's a little contrived. They're looking to force you to use the commutative and associative properties by grouping together numbers that you can probably add or multiply in your head. So looking at this, I have a 23 which ends in a 3, a 37 which ends in a 7. I know 3 and 7 is going to give me a 10. So if I put those two numbers next to each other, I can add those two in my head pretty easily. Okay, so what I did there, that was the commutative property of addition, because I rearranged the numbers. Now what I want to do is, I want to make sure that I add those two first. So I'm going to put parentheses around those. And anytime I put parentheses around something, that's the associative property, and in this case of addition. And now I can add this in my head. That's going to give me 60 plus 42, which is the substitution property, because I substituted 60 for 23 plus 37. And adding 60 and 42, I get 102. And again, that's substitution. So yes, this is a little bit contrived. You normally wouldn't do it this way, but the textbook is trying to force you to see that you can really use the commutative and associative properties to do a lot of this simplifying in your head. Okay. Number 4, 2.75 plus 3.5 plus 4.25 plus 1.5. And again, I'm going to rearrange these a little bit so that I can do some mental math. I'm noticing a 0.75 and a 0.25. Think money, 75 cents, 25 cents. That's going to give me one whole. And here I have a 0.5 or a 1/2 and another 0.5. So I'm going to rearrange these so that my number that ends in the 0.75 and my number that ends in the 0.25 are next to each other. And my two numbers that end with 0.5 are next to each other. And again, that's the commutative property, because I rearranged or commuted the numbers around. Now I'm going to put parentheses around the ones that I want to kind of force myself to add first. So I'm going to add those two, and then I'll add my third and fourth numbers here. And anytime I put parentheses around something, it's the associative property, and in this case of addition. Now I can do this in my head. 0.75 and 0.25 gives me 1, plus 2 plus 4 gives me a 7, and then 0.5 plus 0.5 gives me a 1, plus 3 plus 1 gives me 5. That was a substitution. And 7 plus 5 is 12. Again, a substitution. Okay. And let's take a look at one last example here. I have 1/4 times 24 plus 2/3. A couple different ways I could do this. I don't really necessarily want to multiply the two fractions together. I don't see anything that's going to really easily cancel there. But I think what I'd like to do is, I think I'd like to multiply the second and third terms times each other. So I'm going to put parentheses around those two. Okay, and that's going to be the associative property. of multiplication. I could have chosen to do the first two, but you know, I just decided to do the second two. Okay, so 1/4 times, now 24 times 2 over 3, I can do a little canceling here. That becomes a 1, that becomes an 8. So that's going to be 16, and that was substitution, because instead of saying 24 times 2/3, I said 16, and then 1/4 times 16, again, I can do some canceling. That's going to give me a 4, and that is substitution. So again, these last three problems were a little bit contrived, forcing you to use the associative and commutative properties, but please do go back and take a look at those properties at the very beginning and make sure that you have all of those memorized and you understand how they're used.